I'm a consultant. I work with companies and cities on their zero waste and carbon reduction goals, specifically from the lens of construction. So I'm going to be talking about zero waste construction kind of on a holistic level and thinking about like what are the components that we need for a robust zero waste construction. I know that the majority of folks on this call are on the design side, and so my role is typically on the owner side. And I think that kind of as I go through this, it's just really important to think about, this topic is about circularity. It's really important to think about zero waste and reuse as a circular thing. You can't really have one without the other. So I'm going to be going through this and kind of thinking about, all of these components together. And then I'll also talk through some of the barriers that I've come across and then give a couple of examples as well. And so I'll start out with design, since Amy just kind of touched on this. So design is here. One of the things that we typically think about when it comes to reuse and circularity is that sometimes we only really start thinking about it on the downstream side, the end of life management. It really starts here. Amy talked about inventory-based design. We also look at design for disassembly docs, so making sure that disassembly is part of the schematic design process and part of the design process throughout. That includes, making a plan for adhesives and fasteners and all of those things that make reuse and circularity really difficult at end of life. In order to think about inventory-based management, either as like, and this is really true for if you're, designing one project or several, you need to have an idea of what is actually in inventory. So I know that, we're going to touch on materials marketplaces, but this is something that requires storage. There needs to be an opportunity to know what items are in existence, are in inventory, whether it's within a company or a city or municipality, whatever. And then also making sure that there's enough storage capacity at part of that ecosystem for whatever inventory is coming out of projects and hopefully will be going into projects. In order to maintain attic stock and just having an idea of what is even, of what materials are even available, this really comes down to having some sort of tracking and verification process at the beginning of demolition or construction. We need to know what kind of materials even exist in order to set aside storage in order to make sure that there's storage available. So a zero waste audit consists of, making sure that there's a bill of quantities. This is done at the beginning of either demolition or construction, and done much further, done pretty far before demo construction even begin. This directly, having a zero waste audit directly informs making sure that there's a budget available for deconstruction, storage, and transport. Oftentimes in, construction and development projects, there's the CapEx planning takes place, far in advance of any one individual construction project. And there's typically one line item for waste management. And so in order to get to a point where we know kind of what deconstruction, storage, and transport even look like and what we need to budget for that, that's really where having a zero waste audit and making sure that that's continually being done and making sure that there's cost estimates coming in from subs about what the plans are for materials, and then keeping track of that information. So that's informing the budget. I have done here procurement. Obviously, this is going to differ based on like what, company, municipality, individual project, et cetera. But again, like all of these different aspects are informing kind of the policy and enforcement that helps set the stage for any future construction projects. On the design side, I have over here take back opportunities. as we know, zero waste is really difficult in construction. And so as we're working toward designing buildings on the upstream side, making sure that there's requirements for take back, making sure that there's manufacturer responsibility, that we know that the materials that are going into the buildings have a plan for end of life way before construction even begins. And so as we're working through, what materials are even in the building, making sure that there's take back opportunities as planned, and that we're also discovering, which vendors have opportunities for take backs, and making sure that those requirements are written into material specifications and vendor requirements going forward. I'll talk about metrics in a second. The last thing I have up here is just on-site source separation. So typically, as part of a zero waste audit, you're obviously making a plan for the materials that are in the project, and then what the plan is for those materials. This includes having multiple bins on site, depending on space. This can be really doing a zero waste audit every single time can sometimes be really time inefficient, and really just kind of thinking about on-site source separation as part of that budgeting, making sure that there's at least 5 bins on site per construction project to capture the majority of material that's going out of that construction or demolition project, making sure that we're capturing, again, there's space available, and also budget available for these materials on site, and then doing, periodic audits on the miscellaneous bin. So we're getting to a point where we can say, okay, these are the items that continue showing up in the miscellaneous bin. These are the items that we need to work into our design and upstream specifications, as either making sure that we're not using those materials anymore, or making sure that there's a plan for how those materials can be either reused or recycled at the end of their life. The last thing that I'll touch on here is metrics. Again, I think as designers and folks that are stakeholders in the construction process, I think metrics are really a tool and lever that we can use to push circularity and reuse. I think that diversion is a lacking metric in a lot of ways, just because the opportunities for recycling for construction material can often be few and far between. It varies so much, and recycling in and of itself is an imperfect practice. So as we think more towards circularity and reuse, thinking about that holistically, and all of the different other opportunities that are available to us to make sure that construction is being looked at, holistically and in a zero waste way. So I have a couple different ones here. I have pounds per square foot, and this is a new lead option under construction waste management. And this is pounds of waste generated per square foot. And I wanted to say that I think that oftentimes this is going to be really difficult for contractors to do. Laura will definitely talk about this as well. I think this is an imperfect metric for a lot of reasons, and actually should be more used on the design side as a metric, as part of thinking about reuse as part of the design process. Because oftentimes once we get to the end of life, I think that the options are very few and far between. But thinking about this as an alternative to diversion, and putting the onus more on the design side to support this metric going forward. I also have here Scope 3 reporting. Obviously, embodied carbon is a hot topic nowadays, and that's part of Scope 3 reporting for both companies and cities, and under capital goods and purchase goods. As we think about using Scope 3 and embodied carbon tracking and reporting as a metric, that can be tied really well into zero waste goals, just because a lot of times, as we're reducing carbon, we're also reducing waste. And then the last things that I have here are just ASHRAE regulation and air quality tracking. I think especially since COVID, air quality is something that a lot is just really important, and we're realizing the importance of air quality. Demolition creates a lot of particulate matter. And so making sure that like on projects and from an owner perspective, we're tracking, we're using ASHRAE regulation and air quality regulation, and then we're using particulate matter tracking as a lever to decrease demolition and increase deconstruction. So we go down here. I just wanted to quickly touch on some of the barriers to zero waste construction overall. I'll start over here on the onus on the contractor. Again, a lot of times by the time the GC has responsibility, reuse is really too late for a lot of reasons. And so just making sure that there's, as Amy was talking about, that the integrative process has responsibility on design and upstream as well. And then we also know that labor and schedule impacts are huge when it comes to adding in deconstruction or reuse near the end of a project. And so making sure that we're tracking information. So there's budget, there's ample budget requirements for the beginning of a project as well. Legal and HR, I know that these are barriers. I haven't run into them as much, but just making sure that we're aware of them in order to either advise owners or making sure that these barriers are being addressed. Reuse liability, I know that sometimes there are union restrictions for having certain types of contractors on site. These are two big ones. Municipal regulation. A lot of times construction projects are committed to one hauler, and whatever that hauler can do, just because of hauler contracts with the city, self-haul restrictions. I know that Cal Green has specific requirements around tracking diversion for an entire project, which can sometimes make it difficult to do source separation. And so just, again, these are not permanent barriers, but just making sure that we're aware of them in order to address them. And then lastly, just waste hauler restrictions. Obviously, recycling is a volatile market. There's always going to be variations from city to city, and just making sure that as we're doing like any sort of source separation on site, that there is ample opportunity to address some of those barriers up front. Alrighty, I want to give two quick examples that are specific to zero waste construction. This is a program that I have built for a larger tech company based out of Cupertino. This is a company that has a lot of different sites across a global scale. But again, in thinking about zero waste construction holistically, there's kind of two parts to this. One is just upstream, one is downstream, and then the different pillars or components for each of those aspects of overarching program. You can't really have one without the other. And then as we're thinking about, these two components, the mechanisms that underlie the program comes down to enforcement. That's where that procurement and policy need to come into play, reporting and verification, making sure that all of that information that's being reported, whether it's waste, avoided waste, whatever the metrics are being added into a budgetary process to maintain the opportunity to think about this from or to think about this further in advance. Resource and education, that's true for both the owner side, the design side, the contractor side, making sure that there's contract requirements for GCs, for their subs, et cetera, contractors and vendors. And then lastly, just making sure that there's a narrative and, recording of the different zero waste or circularity efforts that are done, so that learning can be continued to be enforced in other projects. When we talk about a zero waste audit, which is a part of both of these, this is what that could look like. I know that several cities have similar requirements for their projects. But a bill of quantities assessment is making sure that you're literally recording every single material that's in that space. Having a demolition recovery goal, making sure that there's a plan for each of those materials. Again, this can be really time consuming, so it's not necessarily a recommendation to use this for each project, but I think the purpose of this here is a lot of materials aren't going to go in one of those 5 bins if you're doing source separation on site. And so what is the plan for those materials? Are they going into the miscellaneous bin? Are they going to landfill? Are there opportunities for manufacturer take back? So I think as we go further in this process of zero waste construction, the level of detail is not always necessary, but the purpose of doing this type of audit beforehand is just thinking about the plan for materials and making sure that there's especially opportunity for take back for hard to recycle or recover materials.
Well,
so lastly, I wanted to just touch on a project that we've been working on for a while. I know that Kinley and Alex and Katie are on the call too, so maybe they can add some color to this, maybe during the Q&A part. But and this is a slide that actually Kinley created, but this is a project to create a salvage lumber warehouse in King County. Again, thinking about this as an ecosystem, you'll see like all of the different inputs and outputs that go into that would go into having a robust lumber warehouse for the industry in King County. There's about 300,000 tons of clean wood that go into or that are produced in King County every year, and it's estimated that about 70% of that either goes to hog fuel or landfill. And then lastly, just kind of wanted to touch on again, like as we're thinking about salvage and reuse from a larger perspective, a salvage lumber warehouse is part of that. And then also thinking about like, how do we build out a circular ecosystem in King County? All of these things are necessary, and all of these things are part of that and can't really exist without the other. So that is all I have. Thank you.